Joan Kerr, and this is WorldCanvass. Thank you for being with us tonight for our program investigating slavery and gender. WorldCanvass is presented by University of Iowa International Programs, your global intersection, connecting Iowa with the world in a university without borders. We're gathered in the Senate chamber of the Old Capitol Museum tonight, and this program will be broadcast over UI-TV, KRUI-FM, and Iowa Public Radio. We're also streaming WorldCanvass live over International Programs website, which is international.uiowa.edu. Live streaming is made possible by our partners in ITS Information Technology Services. The focus of our discussion tonight, slavery and gender, is nothing if not compelling, and our guests bring a wealth of knowledge and perspective to a human tragedy the scale of which is unimaginable and whose history is as old as time. This program was developed with the help of UI history faculty members Leslie Schwalm and Elke Stockreiter, and the director of the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies, Teresa Mangum. And the genesis lay in the symposium supported by the Obermann Center and international programs called Causes and Consequences: Global Perspectives on the History of Slavery. The symposium takes place here at the University of Iowa next week, October 13th to the 15th, and there are a number of public events which we'll talk about in a moment. Let me now introduce the people who are on stage with me. Leslie Schwalm, professor of history at the University of Iowa, is the guest here in the center, and Teresa Mangum, professor of English and also the director of the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies here in the far end. And just next to me is Lee Vandervelde, a professor of law at the University of Iowa and the author of the book Mrs. Dred Scott, A Life on Slavery's Frontier. Please give our guests a warm welcome. So, Leslie, I would like to turn to you first and ask you to give us something of an overview on this topic. Obviously, you've been organizing this big symposium, this idea of slavery and gender. What are you trying to accomplish here?
Well, it's a big goal that we have, and that is to bring to the university community, the Iowa City community, the regional community, the opportunity to think about how the history of slavery and the history of gender have intersected, how they have reinforced each other, how they have reinforced mutual ideas and ideologies about the treatment of the enslaved and the treatment of women and of men. It's a very big topic, and we're really pleased that the symposium is ranging from Sudan to Zanzibar to 15th century Valencia to Brazil to Maryland to Iowa. So it's the project, the symposium has a very big scope, not only in terms of place, but also in terms of time. One of our keynote lectures, I suspect, will cast back about 40,000 years. So,
40,000 years.
Joseph Miller, one of our keynote speakers, is now known for his very big sweeping essays about gender in the history of slavery. So we'll be thinking very big, and then we'll be thinking very specific.
Well, your colleague Elke Stockreiter put a piece in the Press Citizen this week, which many of us have read, and it's a wonderful piece. And she talks about slavery not just as something that many may think is an historical event. It happened, it's over, it doesn't exist anymore. Not at all true, huh?
Not at all true, of course. And we know from recent developments in our own home state, both in the treatment of disabled men who worked in the turkey industry, and then also undocumented workers who also have worked in very, very miserable conditions. That this is an issue not just far away across the ocean, but here at home as well.
So how do you define slavery?
Well, this is, like I said, a big topic, but if we look across time and if we look across space, we can oftentimes come up with some real common characteristics. Slavery means that a person is treated as property. They are a piece of property that can be traded and bought and sold and inherited and willed like a cow or a favorite chair. Another defining characteristic is the use of violence. Slavery always brings with it violence. Sometimes that violence is very direct, Sometimes it is implicit. But slavery always involves a level of violence, both in terms of becoming enslaved, but also of being forced to live under the institution of slavery. That always requires coercion. Under slavery, the enslaved person never owns their labor power, so slavery is always involved in some way with the exploitation of someone's labor. Now, we have this idea in the United States that involves plantation slavery, and oftentimes it did, but the labor of slaves that was exploited could be anything from an artisan to a soldier. Slave labor has taken just about every form you can imagine in world history, so that's also a very big category. Slaves are always outsiders. They are always defined as outsiders, and that definition varies. Sometimes it rotates around religiosity, sometimes around ethnicity, sometimes around language, sometimes around physical geography. But slaves are always outsiders, and very interestingly, if you look across time and across space, race is actually an unimportant category of defining the enslaved as outsiders. It's using race as a defining characteristic is a very modern invention. Another very horrible aspect of slavery, and an aspect that actually several of our symposium presenters will be addressing, is that slaves, enslaved people, men and women, have no right to their own sexuality or to their reproductive capabilities. In other words, slaves' bodies and their sexuality and their ability to reproduce was always controlled by someone else, with very, of course, profound implications for men and for women. And then lastly, the status of the slave is one which is heritable. That is, the children of enslaved people are enslaved themselves, which again makes motherhood and fatherhood under slavery something very twisted. Right? So those are the characteristics that historians will point to.
Right. Well, and your conference is on slavery and gender. And you mentioned in an earlier conversation we had that very often the popular conception is that slaves are male.
Yeah. We have this notion, and it comes in part from popular culture. It comes from our vision of both the heroic resistance to slavery, which I think in most Americans' minds comes in the form of a Nat Turner or a male insurrectionist. And it also comes from our vision of the victim of slavery, that is the so-called Sambo, the demasculated male. Both of those are, unfortunately, very common tropes in popular culture and really allow the male experience to substitute for the human experience. So what all of the historians coming to the symposium understand is that, again, if we look at time and across space, slavery is a predominantly female experience. Any given time, you're going to have more women enslaved than you are men, for a variety of different historical reasons. But what that means is we can't understand this system of exploitation unless we understand how the people involved in it understood gender, their own gender, and other people's gender, and how they used that to exploit and control people.
Is this part of the investigation into slavery somewhat new, looking at it as the two parts, slavery and gender, linked together?
Well, it had some early origins, mostly in the literature on the Caribbean and South America. In the United States, the first book on this subject was published in 1984. And the Library of Congress did not have a category of information to place the book under. So the Library of Congress actually had to create a new category of knowledge to accommodate this amazing new book that finally addressed women's experience of slavery. So it's a recent field, yes.
Right, right. Well, let's break for a minute and talk to you, Teresa. Teresa Mangum, as I mentioned earlier, is both an English professor and the head of the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies. And I'll first just ask you to tell people what the Obermann Center is.
Well, the first thing I'd like to say before I talk a little bit about the Obermann Center is I would just like to say that our former director for many years, Jay Simmel, is here in the audience, and it's his vision that led to wonderful programs like the Humanities Symposium, and under his leadership, this particular symposium that's so important was planned. So just a shout out to Jay from all of us. The Obermann Center for Advanced Studies is a unit on campus that has, at its simplest, one mission, and that is the support of faculty members' research. So that faculty members have many different kinds of duties on campus, teaching responsibilities, administrative responsibilities, but this is one place in the university that devotes all of our efforts and fundraising purely to helping faculty produce the new ideas, discoveries, and innovations that are going to carry us into and through the 21st century. And I just feel grateful to be part of facilitating that work. The other thing that the Obermann Center has also actually become known for all over the country is that whereas at many universities there's a center that supports research in the sciences and another for research in the humanities, the vision of the Obermann Center way back from its origins was to support interdisciplinary exploration and discovery. And so a number of the programs at the center are designed to bring faculty members and sometimes graduate students and other people who are academic staff on campus, to bring them together at the center to have a chance for somebody who's working in genetics to talk to somebody who's working in ethics in the philosophy department, and somebody who's looking at global health issues and how discussions of genetics are playing out in a radically different way in other parts of the world, so that it is a place where we break out of our expected programs of work, we break out of the ways that one or another of us would see an idea in a discipline, and it's that those encounters, informal and structured encounters, those rich discussions and writing articles together, building symposia together, that really makes it possible to leap forward in how we think and how we create and how we can then share ideas with the rest of the world. And I just think that the symposium that we're already hearing about here is a great example of slavery. For most of you who you remember from your college courses or your own study, so often is thought about in a very specific national way. And an awful lot of us, I'll accept responsibility myself, come up thinking of slavery as a distinctively American institution. That has been challenged more and more as attention has shifted to what's been called the Black Atlantic, this whole notion of the migrations across time and space from Africa via the Caribbean to the United States, but also often to Europe, to South America, Central America, all across the world. But that, despite the fact that people know that migration history, that movement history, there tends to be, as Leslie's already pointed out, this emphasis on one movie view of plantation slavery in the American South. And Leslie's symposium is so amazing because it is opening up a whole new conversation about the ways that at the same time we think about our slavery, the inheritance of slavery as a national institution, that we are missing enormously important understanding of forms of oppression more broadly if we don't think globally and comparatively. And I just think this symposium is not only going to be important for us here in Iowa to learn, but I think the book that will follow is just going to be a groundbreaking, international, game-changing understanding of the nature of oppression across time and the world, and its continuing impact.
You've given such a nice description of the Obermann Center's collaborative work, and I work for IP, and I just like to mention here that your project also received what we call IP Major Project funds from the group who works with international programs. They also saw the value in this project as something that would add to scholarship, add to understanding, and would allow faculty to sort of cross from their own individual departmental silos into a new space where they, could think of it in a new way. So
Absolutely.
It's very exciting.
And if I can just say, I mean, this is even seen in those of us who are organizing this. We have myself, who studies American history, my colleague Kathy Komisarek, who studies Mesoamerica, and my colleague Elke Stockrider, who studies Zanzibar. Yeah. And we're all bringing very different sets of knowledge to this, and finally having a conversation about what we know that's very similar and what's very different.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we have a third guest with us right here on stage, and she also teaches here at the University of Iowa, but in the law school. This is Lee Vandervelde, just next to me. Thank you for being with us, Lee. And
it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I will ask you actually to describe your own interests, research in labor, and you've also done lots of research in, employment policies and things like this. But you can talk about certain parts of your legal work, or you can talk about what drew you to this story of Mrs. Dred Scott, and I think you even had a Guggenheim Fellowship to work on this project. And the book is called Mrs. Dred Scott, A Life on Slavery's Frontier.
Yes. I wanted to just add something to some of the wonderful structure that Leslie gave, the definition of slavery. And the point that I want to add to it is, as she was mentioning, that it's heritable, meaning from generation to generation. One inherits a slave and one can be inherited. It's matrilineal in its heritability. So the nature of gender is built right into the structure of the property that's retained from generation to generation. The children of a slave man are not necessarily enslaved. It all depends on the status of their mother. That's a gender significance that I think we overlook. And I think it's partly what led me to Mrs. Dred Scott and what provided a solution in Mrs. Dred Scott for something that I had been looking for. Now, I'm coming from a legal tradition, and in the legal tradition, we're always talking about the Constitution, and we're talking about where are the women in the Constitution. Well, we have a nod to the head of Abigail Adams for reminding us to remember the women, but beyond that, it's all men who are thought to be the intenders of the Constitution. So imagine my surprise when I'm assigned to teach constitutional law and I discover that this most famous and unknown of cases, Dred Scott, actually involved a mother and her daughters, as well as Dred Scott, the husband, in whose name it had to be filed by coverture reasons. All of a sudden, we have a woman as a constitutional intender in the constitutional panoply of creating the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Well, I was keen to find out more about her. And so to find out more about her, I discovered that she had been living principally in Minnesota. Of 4 million slaves, why is it that a Minnesota slave is the slave who brings the most notorious case to the United States Supreme Court? I grew up in Wisconsin. I didn't know there were Minnesota slaves. And the more I looked, I found that there were Wisconsin slaves and Iowa slaves and Indiana slaves and Michigan slaves. And virtually every place that I had been taught there were no slaves, the more I looked, the more I did see that there were slaves there. And this very last week, I found some slaves owned by William Henry Harrison in Indiana. He says he's in the process of freeing them, but I found a bill of sale for $400 that he paid to their owner, so I don't think it was necessarily in the process of freeing them when he signed them on for another 25 years of labor. Mrs. Dred Scott is an interesting story that captured me and took me a long time to research and to discover, but it's a puzzle, and the pieces kept coming from different places wherever I would look. I have a tremendous thanks to all the librarians and all the people who are digitizing works, because without that, I know I couldn't find some of the stuff I found. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to read you just one page from Mrs. Dred Scott, and it's the page that gives you the overview of who she was, what her life was, and then we can maybe turn to why it's important. The page that I'm going to read to you is actually from the introduction. And remember that I'm citing her as someone whose grievance led to the notorious United States Supreme Court case that required, for legal reasons, the Civil War. Sure, Fort Sumter was fired on by the South Carolinians. Sure, there were acts of treason. But before that, Justice Roger Taney had declared that Black Americans had no rights, they were not citizens, and white persons need not respect any of the rights. This is written on the background of the life of a woman he doesn't know. She's not in the courtroom. She's in St. Louis, not in Washington, D.C. I've established that. But I did want to know what led to her filing this lawsuit, and so I want to tell you just a little bit about it by reading you no more than a page. Harriet's was a life that could be equaled by few that century. She had lived for several years surrounded by Sioux and Ojibwa people who spoke languages at first unknown to her. She endured brutally cold Minnesota winters. She traveled the extent of what was then the nation on the steamboat, the most advanced means of travel of the time. She had served some of the century's most important, best educated, engaging, and ambitious men. She had served them at her master's table. She returned from the wilderness frontier as a free Black person to live in a slave state that increasingly turned to law to circumscribe her personal liberties. She nursed her aging husband and kept her family intact in St. Louis through fires, floods, and epidemics. She sat silently beside her husband in the courtroom and hid her children for their safety while holding out for her family's freedom in a hostile environment for more than a decade. A legal battle that extended to the highest court of the land. This modest, ordinary, low-born young woman accomplished something extraordinary. From all the evidence, it was her idea to bring suit, and her determination carried her family through. Harriet didn't set out to change the world. She only sought to free her family and herself from slavery. Though illiterate, Black, and hence perceived as different in the racial caste system of the times, the mother of 2 young children and also desperately poor, challenged the claim that she and her family were slaves. The lawsuit, in turn, pitted her family against one of the most wealthy, most powerful families in America, John F.A. Sanford, the financial power broker of the American Fur Company. She and her husband ultimately lost the most important and dramatic lawsuit in the history of the United States Supreme Court. But when the High Court took up her case and rejected her claim of freedom, it convulsed the entire system of law and justice in the nation, leading to a civil war.
So, anyone who might have just joined us, you're reading from Mrs. Dred Scott, the book you've written on the wife, obviously, of Dred Scott, this person whose name we know from the Supreme Court case and what you've just described. But could you just, in a couple of sentences, for people who don't remember that case, tell us what it was very, very briefly?
The Dred Scott case is one of those cases that everybody's heard the name of. And it is the longest case that the Supreme Court had ever written to that point. It runs for more than 90 pages, so it's not something that one is likely to thread one's way through. It's a hard case. It's steeped in legal pleadings and terminology and jurisdictional questions. But it holds 3 things, and these 3 things are a complete shutout for African American slaves in search of reform in the nation. The three things that it holds are: one, that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional; two, that the Northwest Ordinance was unconstitutional. Now, that's two declarations of unconstitutionality by the United States Supreme Court, who had never declared two things to be unconstitutional in the same case before. But then they go on for a third. Because you see, there are the Scott children to consider, the daughters. And even had they shut out Dred and had they shut out Harriet, there would have been a very good case that could have been brought by one or perhaps both of the daughters for their freedom the very next day. They shut out the litigants a third time by basically saying that no African American can ever be a citizen of the United States, despite what states might say. And since you have to be a citizen of the United States in order to have jurisdiction under the court, it basically shuts out all further litigation. Now, why is it that this particular family pursued? Well, I think it has to do with the matrilinearity again. It has to do with the fact that if you look at the value of the people who compose that family, Dred is over 50, he has tuberculosis, and he's not considered worth a dime, according to one of the opposition lawyers. Harriet, however, has had 2 children. She's still of childbearing age. She can still have children. And her 2 daughters are just coming to the age where they could be sold separately from the family, since most slave children were not sold before they were 7 years old, simply for the purposes of maintenance. So, why is it that this suit is filed? I think it was for purposes of family integrity, to keep the family together, to protect the daughters. They're the 2 lives in the balance that have the most worth to their owners. Dred, at his point in life, well, he, as one of the counsel says, is not worth a dime.
So you decided that you needed to find out more about Mrs. Dred Scott. Every review I've read says this is really groundbreaking work that you've written, and you learned about her life through journals, through court documents. What kinds of research did you have to go into in order to learn more about this very unimportant, in quotes, person's life?
Well, I have to tell you that a couple things kept me going. And one of the things that kept me going was the challenge. It was a puzzle from start to end. One of the things that I discovered, and which gave me a huge break in trying to figure out about the circumstances of her life, was to discover her master's diary, just sitting in the Minnesota Historical Society. There it was, 20 years of day by day, whether the root cellar had been built, what was planted in the garden, whether a milk cow had given birth to a calf. All of that was there, and there were only 5 people in that household, so you could pretty much figure out what it was that Harriet was doing. Now, it's interesting to think about this because why was it in the Minnesota Historical Society for so long, and I was the first person to sort of put it together with the Dred Scott case? Well, it's because always before people focused on Dred, the husband. It's only at the point that you consider the wife, Harriet, to have an equal significance in deciding what's important for the family that you begin looking through her heritage, and there it was. The other thing that was interesting is that Tolliver was interpreted for his place in history as being an Indian agent for the Dakota tribe. Nobody noticed that he held 21 slaves over the course of his lifetime, many of which he held in Minnesota, but most importantly, that one of the people that he held turned out to be the litigant of the nation's most important lawsuit. The second thing, though, that was the discovery is that as long as I had her master telling a story, telling me when it snowed, when it rained, whether there was a flood, whether the milk cow had given birth to a calf or not, I kind of knew what the nature of things in that household was. But then, he says he gave her in marriage to Dred, performing a ceremony in which they would be man and wife. Not slave and cohort, but man and wife. Then, how do I track her life? She's going to St. Louis. St. Louis is an enormous city, as many people in the audience know. In looking for her traces in St. Louis, I came upon something in the St. Louis courthouse that helped me explain the story. I found the first 10 of what was going to turn out to be 300 cases of slaves suing for their freedom in the St. Louis courts. I could tell her story by looking at the cohorts of the people whose lives she lived her life among. Now, how did I find this? Well, it's a little like John Malkovich movie. There is a floor in the St. Louis courthouse that has no floor number. It's between the 3rd and the 4th floor, and you can only find it if you go through one of the stairwells and not through the others. On that floor, there was a wonderful woman who was engaged in data processing. And in her free time, she had looked for slave suits. And she had a very, very important shoebox in the second drawer of her desk on that unknown floor.
Wow. Leslie, I want to come to you because you have written a recent book, I think, Abolition's Diaspora, and that book is all about slavery in the parts of the country that many of us, like I, growing up in Iowa, I didn't think that there were so many slaves here, but you really have unearthed an awful lot of this information as well.
Yes, in fact, Lee and I were working on our projects at the same time and had some conversations about these northern slaves that we were uncovering and trying to learn about. There were, as Lee has indicated, a number of slaves in Iowa and Wisconsin and Minnesota. Some carried here by territorial officials, prominent community members. Certainly everyone who visited their households knew that they had slaves in their households. Others were brought to work in lead mines, to work as servants, held illegally in free territory, gave birth to their children in free territory, and were continuously held as slaves. So part of the project for me, and I know this was true for Lee as well, of discovering this history is to force us to reconsider what the Free North really has meant historically. And it's meant easy and casual ignorance of the law and the constitutionality of a so-called free area. It's a pretty a solemn project to work on, to think about this and the tolerance of it. I mean, I do think, again, we labor under an idea that Northerners were opposed to slavery as a whole, and Iowa, of course, has a proud tradition of anti-slavery activism. After all, John Brown came through here and helped slaves escape through Iowa. But, the truth of the matter is that there were probably more enslaved people held in Iowa than there were ever active abolitionists.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. Well, let's just wrap up this story with Mrs. Dred Scott for a second. How did her life end? By the time she died, what had happened in the resolution of their case?
Well, her husband did die within a year of the Supreme Court decision. It's kind of remarkable to look back at this because it was not clear that he was going to make it through the last winter. They had litigated this case for 11 years. And in the 11th winter, there's indication that everybody thought he would die. And if he died, what do you do with the Supreme Court case? It's mooted after 11 years of litigation. But he did survive. He is freed when it's discovered that he's actually owned by a senator from Massachusetts who has married the wife of the man who had owned Dred. So there's a very quick set of embarrassments that this fellow from Massachusetts actually turns out to be, and he's run on the Freedom ticket, actually turns out to be the real owner of Dred Scott, whose name is becoming a household word in the territory. So he is freed. The children come out of hiding. They are freed. And she lives to a ripe old age of 76 years old, staying in St. Louis, basically the subject of some celebrity, but personally sort of eschewing that celebrity. She's listed in the St. Louis directory as Harriet, wife of Dred, long after Dred has passed away. She lives to see her grandchildren born. Her youngest daughter marries. Her oldest daughter never marries, but she sees the grandchildren born. And I've had the pleasure to meet the great-great-great-grandchildren in St. Louis in the recent years.
Wow. Oh, thanks for sharing that with us. And at this point, I'd like to invite our next two guests up. Barbara and Mary Helen, if you would come on up and join us here. I'd like to just remind everybody that you're listening to WorldCanvass from International Programs. I'm Joan Kerr, and our subject this evening is slavery and gender. So just sitting down now are Mary Helen Stefaniak, who has the printed skirt, and hello, Mary Helen, author, and good to have you with us. And at the very end is Barbara Mooney, and you're an art historian, and very happy to have you here, teacher at the University of Iowa. So please welcome our two new guests. Mary Helen Stefaniak is the author of the book Self-Storage and Other Stories, The Turk and My Mother, and The Cailiffs of Baghdad, Georgia. She's also the winner of the Binghamton University John Gardner Fiction Book Award. She teaches creative writing at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska, and the University of Iowa here in Iowa City. And Barbara teaches courses on American architecture, modern and contemporary architecture, and African American art. She also serves as the head of the Art History Division in the School of Art and Art History here at the UI. And through a funny set of circumstances, as often happens when you're putting together a program like this, I learned, Mary Helen, about your most recent book, The Cailiffs of Baghdad, Georgia. And I'll have you just tell us what this story is about and why we thought it might weave its way into this story, this program this evening on slavery and gender.
Okay, thank you, Joan. Well, it does have to kind of weave its way in from the side, actually. The book is, I always feel as though when someone says the title, The Cailiffs of Baghdad, Georgia, that I need to explain both why Georgia and why Baghdad. And my mother is from Georgia, from kind of central, middle of Georgia, and from the time I was very small, well, I guess I would have to say I didn't know that you could go on a vacation that wasn't a trip to Georgia. I sort of thought those two words were synonyms. And so every year we visited my mother's relatives in Georgia. I myself grew up in Milwaukee. My father's from Milwaukee. My parents met when my father was stationed in Georgia during the Second World War. So that was why Georgia. In a way, I kind of, although I was always there on vacation, which is different from the rest of your life, I did always have this sort of I felt as though I had this kind of double view of things. I felt as though Milwaukee, where I was from, looked a little different to me every time I came back from Georgia, and that Georgia looked, my mother's like from the Macon, Milledgeville area, obviously, looked somewhat different to me because I was from Milwaukee, but also you kind of have a place there because you've got all this family there. You have a huge family. So even though you talk funny as far as they are concerned, you have an entree. So the situation of probably the first vacation or the longest ago I can remember going to Georgia, I was probably in the late 1950s. So I really, kind of made regular stops there through a very, tumultuous and important period of history. So George has always been. I've written about characters drawn from my mother's family before, and that's always this kind of a part of the geography and history of my work. But I came to write this book because I knew I was going to write. I had finished The Turk and My Mother, my previous novel, and I knew that I wanted to write a book that was set in Georgia. But then in March 2003, I had just sort of barely started to think about it, sort of write little scenes. And in March 2003, and I remember specifically that it was March 23rd, 2003, I was reading the paper, and I was reading an article about one of the first reports on the shock and awe bombing of Baghdad. And at that point, I just decided that I wanted to write a novel, wherever it would be, and whatever. I wanted to write a novel in which a group of Americans, had a different relationship to Baghdad than the one that was being developed, kind of officially and non-officially in 2003. And so for my Americans, I kind of turned to my mother's for a variety of reasons, but mostly for the ones I said, just because it was familiar and important to me. I turned to the middle of Georgia, a little tiny town, fictional town based on a real town, called Three Step, Georgia, in 1938-39. So most of the book is narrated by 11-year-old Gladys Cailiff, one of the Cailiffs of the title, and she's telling you about the school year in which Miss Spivey, a new school teacher, well-traveled school teacher, comes to town and revives the town festival, which is sort of entwined with the school activities, as an exotic Baghdad bazaar, complete with camels. And partly that's because that was the first thing I thought of. I'm trying to get a connection, between Georgia and Baghdad, and a well-traveled school teacher seemed like a plausible connection, and one who had a 10-volume set of the Arabian Nights, so that's where I started. But I continued to read about Baghdad, looking for connections, and found some other interesting ones too. But the most interesting one actually came about because I was looking for purposes of the plot, I needed a coastal island, and there are some Arabs that end up in hiding on that coastal island. This is about the time of the First World War, and in visiting, my husband and I, on one of our annual trips to Georgia with my mother, went to Sapelo Island, and which I highly recommend. Probably maybe many people have been to Sapelo Island, but we took the tour. You have to take a tour of Sapelo Island. You have to have business there. And the University of Georgia has a marine institute, and there's a nature preserve. And there's also a little town called Hog Hammock. And most of the people in that town are descendants, one way or the other, of the slaves who worked on the plantation, the last plantation, which was a very large one that took up most of the island. And subsequently, most of the island was owned by an automobile magnate, like in the 19-teens and 20s, and then he kind of went on the skids during the Depression, and it was purchased by R.J. Reynolds, the tobacco heir, and who's kind of the reason why there were lots of... the reason why it didn't get turned into golf courses, I guess, is really what he was instrumental in that. But it was after the tour that we went to the visitors center, which was like a little mini museum. And now for years by now, I'm looking for connections between my people in Georgia and something about Baghdad or Islamic culture, Arabic culture, the whole kind of broad swath of history and culture that Baghdad sort of represents. Because I'm trying to sort of, I want my people in my novel to retain that meaning of Baghdad. My husband actually is responsible for me kind of pulling me by the elbow over to a little display case and this little mini museum. in the visitor center, and in the display case there was a facsimile of a notebook, a little handmade, handwritten notebook. And I later got to actually page through the actual notebook, which is in the library at the University of Georgia in Athens. And the amazing thing about this notebook was that it was written in Arabic. It was clearly Arabic script. I can't read Arabic script, but no one on the tour had said anything about that would make you expect this notebook. And it turned out I didn't have to look very far at all for an Islamic connection, kind of Baghdad connection to Georgia, because the notebook was it was the notebook belonging to a man named Bilali Muhammad, who had been a slave, and the slave overseer had been a very important man, but a slave on that last plantation. So there was my my ultimate Baghdad connection, and it led to my writing another section of the book, really, that kind of gives you the background, kind of delves into some aspects of history that touch on the characters that we've already met in 1938-39. So, and the fact that Bilali came to Georgia, from the Bahamas. You mentioned the movement from Africa to the Bahamas. When he was 14 years old, he was kidnapped, or maybe was a prisoner of war. It's not clear. But he was brought to the Bahamas, and he lived there. He lived through the prime of his life there and was a very important man on that plantation. And then when Bilali was in his 40s, about 1802, 1803, a young man from Georgia who had consolidated his land on Sapelo Island was looking for somebody who knew a lot about Sea Island cotton. He was, in fact, and we talked about this sort of image we have of slaves and manual labor, but Bilali was purchased by Thomas Spalding for his knowledge of how to run a plantation, how to grow Sea Island cotton and indigo, and the other things that he was interested in, and sugar that he was interested in devoting his plantation to. So that was a very that was a thing that I didn't know about either, that people were purchased for their knowledge and their skills. And I also had no idea that there were literate Muslims among the slaves, but I suppose why not? West Africa was for many centuries full of literate Muslims. So that's where that story came from.
Mm-hmm. Did you want to read a little bit of it for us, or?
Oh, well, I could do that. I guess the part that I thought I might read is, it's not narrated by 11-year-old Gladys. At the climax of the book, something terrible happens in 1939 in Three-Step, Georgia. And while everyone is waiting to see how it will turn out, there's a night of storytelling, and this is one of the stories that gets told. And it has a title. The title of the story is "The Tale of the Veiled Lady," with reference to a book written in the language of the prophet, from which she carried pages in a bag around her neck. And one of the characters for whom this veiled lady is, in fact, he knows that she is, in fact, his great-grandmother, is telling this story. So a character in 1939, a black man, is telling this story. And it begins like this. It was late in the year 1864. Even without the lengthy train of tattered but jubilant people walking and riding across Georgia in the wake of the army that set them free, the federal troops led by William T. Sherman and his fellow generals made a procession so long that it took close to a full gray December day for them to pass by. The front of the line was 2 days' march from Savannah when word came down the road about a rice plantation up ahead with a collection of unusual animals, the sort that most of the Yankee soldiers had only heard about but never seen. The talk was of lions and monkeys and elephants. Really, there was only one elephant, and also of camels. "Camels," said Margaret, when her grandson came to tell her what he'd heard. She was rolling along in a wooden cart not much bigger than a wheelbarrow, towed by the mule-drawn wagon in front of her. One of the Yankee soldiers had arranged the cart for Margaret in deference to her age and solemn attire. Lately, she wasn't feeling like herself. Her old bones couldn't get warm, and she knew why. Until the commencement of the current hostilities, Margaret had consumed 2 cups of life-everlasting tea every day of her adult life. Her sorry state right now on 1 cup every other day was proof, if anyone needed it, of the herb's sustaining power. She was down to a single branch of dried leaves in her once full sack, and although she sent Malcolm on foraging expeditions and kept a sharp eye on the roadside herself, no bushy plants with just the right silvery leaves could be found. Unless this army parade could carry her home in a week or less, she was sure to run out before she got there, back to the coast, to Sapelo. Her grandson, Malcolm, held on to the top rail of the cart's perimeter, his bare toes clinging to the smallest of ledges over a wheel. It was some kind of shame, Margaret thought, how dirty his shirt was, how little was left of his pants. She was going to wash him for a week when they got back home. "They got lions," he said. "You seen lions once." Had Margaret ever seen a lion? She must have told him a story borrowed from another lifetime, maybe from her mother's. The boy leaped sideways and waved to her from the grass along the road. Having seen what the Yankees did to livestock, she half hoped that the rumored lions and camels were rumors only. Not that she blamed the hungry soldiers for helping themselves to as much beef and pork on the hoof as they could eat, and she could see why they didn't want the enemy to avail themselves of animals left behind. It was the same reason some of the white farmers and planters shot their own livestock before the Yankees got there. That was the very worst, in Margaret's opinion, coming up on a farm where all the livestock were already dead for days and stinking like a pestilence. It smelled so bad, even in December, it made the babies cry. And I'll stop there to say that Margaret is, as this portion goes on, Margaret is the daughter of Bilali Muhammad, who passed away shortly before the Civil War in 1859, I think. And the reason Margaret has to get back to Sapelo Island is that in 1862, when the Confederate Army abandoned defense of the islands, Thomas Spaulding's heir put all the slaves on boats and sent them to the mainland and then marched them inland for safekeeping, so that the federal troops wouldn't liberate them, right? And then, as it just happens to turn out, which was an astonishing thing as I kept reading, it turns out that where the slaves from Sapelo Island spent those years between 1862 and 1864, and then not all of them returned to the islands as Margaret is doing here, but they spent it in kind of Milledgeville, the Milledgeville area, which is right where my mother was from and right where my story was already taking place. So it seemed like some kind of synchronicity that the story had to get told. I could stop there for a bit.
I'm perfectly happy to have you continue.
To read some more?
Yeah,
Okay.
sure.
All right, I'll do that. I'm always happy to read it. All right. William T. Browning, the rice planter who was until very recently the owner of the much-discussed menagerie up ahead, used to claim that he had captured the creatures on safari in Africa and other exotic locales. The 46 human beings of whom he had also been until very recently the owner knew better. William T. Browning's animals had been purchased from a circus in England more than a decade before. Browning had fetched the animals across the Atlantic himself, feeling like Noah on the ark, much to the dismay of Mrs. Browning, who expected the ship to be filled only with fine furnishings and fabrics worthy of their newly built home. She never fully forgave him for 200 yards of silk on bolts that somehow ended up among the bales of straw lining the elephant's stall. The Brownings had already fled by December 1864, leaving the menagerie behind, along with their more conventional livestock and their human property, the 46 soon-to-be ex-slaves. Mr. Browning had been urged by a neighbor to sacrifice the livestock, but he refused to do it, thanks to the persuasive powers of his animal overseer, a slender black man named Benjamin. Benjamin was remarkable not only for his skills in persuasion and animal husbandry, but for the pointed beard he kept groomed to perfection with nothing but a razor-sharp cane knife, and for his immaculately white turban. Rafters in the barn were always festooned with lengths of white cloth hung up to dry. There were other men in the coastal areas who wrapped their heads thus, but no one wore a turban so snowy white. Under Benjamin's supervision, the people who were slaves on William T. Browning's plantation had been taking excellent care of his menagerie as well as his conventional livestock for many years. When General Sherman arrived at the plantation one warm day in December 1864, his troops were welcomed with a sort of circus parade, the elephant and camels and their riders decked out with rags and streamers, each of the monkeys leashed and chattering on somebody's shoulder, the 2 lions and 1 tiger pacing sluggishly in separate wheeled cages pulled along by teams of ponies. But Margaret was right to worry. Upon seeing that collection of unusual creatures, the first thing the Yankee soldiers did was ask their superiors for permission to let the animals loose in the fields and hunt them down for sport. Their superiors wisely withheld this permission, and yet one of the lions had already been shot by a Yankee soldier pretending to be a lion tamer, such as he'd seen one time at a circus in Chicago. Using a long stick and then a whip handle, he kept poking at the old beast, who was either too tired or too bored to roar, until the soldier on a dare got right up close and stuck his face in the sleepy lion's face in a way that must have made the lion think that this was the part of the show where he was meant to open up wide so the human could put its head into the lion's deadly jaws. The lion opened wide and scared the soldier so badly that he soiled his drawers and raised his pistol and closed his eyes and stuck his arm straight out and shot that lion right in the mouth, causing the poor beast to clamp his jaws shut in surprise. You can bet that Yankee soldier told a different story when he got home about how he lost his arm in the war. Malcolm came and told Margaret about it, his eyes brimming. "Oh, baby," she said, and he let himself be drawn into the folds of her dress, a long, loose dress of the same undyed homespun as her veil. She held him close and asked, "Is he shot dead?" Malcolm tilted his head back and looked up at his grandmother, suddenly hopeful. It hadn't occurred to him that the lion might be shot, but not dead. "You fetch me a cup of hot water," she said, handing him her tin mug, "and we'll go have a look." By the time Malcolm returned from the cook's wagon, walking as fast as he could with his eye on the cup, Margaret had replaced her brown homespun veil with a pale blue one that fell past her shoulders and was fixed so she could pull it across her face and keep it there if she wanted to. Margaret wore the blue veil as a sign of who she was, the daughter of Bilali Mahomet, faithful like her father to the prophet, in her heart slave to no one but God. Malcolm saw it as a sign that she had hopes for the fallen lion. He held the steaming metal cup and watched her pluck leaves of life everlasting from a dried branch and crumble them into the water, which immediately released a pungent and familiar smell. Malcolm breathed it in, and so did his grandmother, their 2 heads, one round and brown, the other draped in blue, bent over the rising wisps. She stirred it with their knife, took the cup from him, and loudly sipped 3 times before she gave it back. He took his sip without complaining, although he didn't like the mossy taste, only the comforting smell. The metal cup was perhaps a quarter full, and his nose was still crinkled when, to his surprise, Margaret crumbled the last leaves from her branch into the cup. Tamping the mixture into a paste, she said, "Thought we'd see if our lion friend needs a little life everlasting." She pulled the veil across her cheekbones and took Malcolm's hand. They passed wagons and horses and staring faces of every shade until they reached the fallen lion's cage. There, the crowd parted. Voices fell silent. Not one of them, not even Benjamin the overseer in his snowy white turban, had ever seen anyone quite like this solemn woman, so straight and tall that no one would ever guess her age at well past 80, her dark brown face half hidden by the pale blue veil. Margaret and Malcolm stopped at the end of the wagon cage where 4 wooden steps led up to a door made of iron bars. Tall, black Benjamin came forward with a big iron key. He bowed and said, "Allahu Akbar." Margaret's hand went to her heart, or so it appeared. Malcolm knew what she was really reaching for. Under her dress, inside a homespun bag that she wore on a cord around her neck, were the pages her father had given to her before he died, pages from an ancient book written in the language of the prophet. "Allahu Akbar," Margaret agreed, and she added, significantly, that God was also merciful. Then she lifted her skirts ankle high, and her bare feet climbed the steps into the cage. Most of the dried blood was near the door, where the Yankee soldier had stood with his foolish face growing paler and paler. The crowd that watched Margaret step neatly around the bloodstains on the floor had witnessed the incident. They had all heard the shot. They had seen the lion fall. They held their breath as Margaret laid her hand on the lion's head and buried her fingers in his mane and leaned to put her veiled face next to his ear. Only those closest to the iron bars heard her say softly, "Old lion, my mother knew your mother. How long have I waited to meet you?" When she told them, as she crouched beside the beast, that the lion was not dead, they did not believe her. They watched her scoop the paste from the tin cup and apply it to the lion's cheek in a fleshy pad of muscle just below the temple, a spot almost hidden by his mane. She straightened up, and even as she told them that the lion would soon awaken, though he would not be in the best of moods, the crowd began to murmur. Everyone had seen the right ear twitch. Well, some saw the left. Margaret exited the wagon cage with dignity, but no dawdling. Word came around later that General Sherman wished to meet the lady with the veil. Stop there.
Thank you, Mary Helen. Please, a hand.
Thank you.
So once again, that's Mary Helen Stefaniak reading from the Cailiffs of Baghdad, Georgia. And we have a lot of conversation that has to come after this. I know that Leslie has followed the history of this area and knows something about this fellow Bilali and this culture. And I know that you, Teresa, sort of grew up just a little north of this area. Barbara, you in art history, I know that you have studied the architecture of this area and the life of slaves and slave descendants. So where should we start? Maybe we'll go to you first, Leslie, and have you just kind of comment on the way Mary Helen has created this story.
Maybe to just give a little context for this area, Sapelo Island and the low country of South Carolina and Georgia. This is a very unique area of the South that had some of the South's largest plantations, its wealthiest planters, and very importantly, very large communities of enslaved people, communities that provided the human resources for life and community and culture, and skilled in rice agriculture and Sea Island cotton production in such a way that their slave owners were reluctant to sell them away. So when there were sales in this region of slaves, they were bought by other planters in the locality, which means that the population of enslaved people here were there for generations. And so when you have a person, an educated Muslim like Bilali, he and his children and his children's children are likely to stay put in this area and contribute in a very significant way to the culture on Sapelo and probably the culture of other communities, because these enslaved people, you know, they had boats and they traveled and they talked to each other and they worshipped with each other. And so it's a very unique area in its stability of its black population, that it wasn't devastated by the domestic slave trade. People were there for many generations. And that is the context that allowed someone like Bilali and his community to be sustained over several generations. Had he lived in Milledgeville, he probably would have been separated off from his family for a long time. So it's a very unique region, and I imagine, Teresa, you know this full well.
Well, I'm from North Carolina, and it's to people who live in Iowa, the difference between North Carolina and South Carolina does not seem extreme. However, if you are from either state, believe me, it seems very extreme. But I mean, I actually had the pleasure of reading the novel, which I recommend to all of you. It made a long day of flying really short. I wasn't quite ready to arrive because I had 2 chapters left. But it really is fascinating to, I think, the South that I grew up in, off and on in my lifetime, was obviously the 60s, the 70s, and it was a period where the white folks and the middle and lower middle class white folks were constantly rewriting history. And those were also people, my family, who had the generations not had the wealth that some of the plantation families had. So there was always this really interesting, complicated sense of self-definition that required, well, it's very hard to explain immediately, but required curious rewritings of what that history had been, partly to justify the fact that there were many white and black families in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s who were living in close proximity, but on no equal terms. I mean, usually the black families were working for the white families, even if they were both even if the socioeconomic level of both groups was not high. And one of the things I so appreciated about the novel is the way that it captures the relationships between black and white children earlier than I would have lived, but that sounded very familiar right on into the 60s, in the ways that there were such incredible structural divisions and economic divisions, and yet equally incredible intimacies, especially among children, but among other parts of families. And the novel just gets at that lived reality of extreme inequality and intimacy that is so hard to fathom if you haven't lived that experience. And I just really appreciated that.
Thanks for reading.
Well, Barbara, let's pull you into this conversation a little bit now, and you can take off wherever you want to. Maybe tell us something about what you've learned about African American architecture, what it tells us about family structures, or the structure of the community, or a sense of space, and so on. Start there, maybe, and then also tell us something about African American art as you see it.
Yes. Well, I came to the field of African American art and architecture literally and figuratively through the back door. My first area of research was on Virginia mansions, these great monuments of white elite power. And this was during the 80s and early 90s. And by that time in academics, largely because of the success of the civil rights movement, students were very much actively agitating and asking for courses that weren't just about male elites, white male elites. And so the idea of studying African American artistic production, looking at the built environments of slavery, became maybe not the most prestigious field in art history, but certainly one that was accepted now, and one for which there was funding, more importantly. And there were graduate students who were interested in pursuing it as well. So I looked out the back door, out the side door, what sort of slave environments, both functional buildings like barns, but especially the domicile of slaves was particularly interesting to me. What I found, and I've expanded my study beyond plantation slave environments. In fact, that's like our concept of American slavery. That's sort of the dominant visual motif in everyone's mind when you imagine Southern slavery. But I've gone beyond that to look at urban slave environments as well, or the environments of industrial slavery. It wasn't just the master and his slaves. It could be a lot of slaves working for a corporation in a quasi-industrialized setting. So actually, I've done some research on St. Louis slavery, and love to read your chapter on Mrs. Dred Scott and how you so well took these disparate little parts of history about the city and meshed it into the actual physical plan of the city and the buildings themselves. So what ties all these environments together, I think, is that the built environment of slavery does not just reflect oppression and racism or outright slavery, but is an active participant in the mechanisms by which people are emasculated, are kept from owning their labor. Separate but unusually in close proximity in St. Louis. Unlike today, where St. Louis is a very, very segregated city, and most cities in the South are, that's beginning to change a little bit. But before emancipation, there was an unusual degree of proximity, but still with codes so that the slave and the owner always knew those distinctions. As Teresa, you said, proximity, but you always knew where the border was. So in St. Louis, you have very close to that north side of the courthouse, you have the Planters Hotel. And in the Planters Hotel, you have rich white merchants, but they need to be groomed. So you have a black barber, he's a free black barber, but he's black barber, making money down in the basement. You have other examples. Barbering is one of the more lucrative jobs a black male could have in a pre-emancipation period. And they're scattered out through the city and earning money. In a hotel that's not too far away, you have a slave dealer on one floor and then a barber in the basement as well. You have neighborhoods where there are very wealthy St. Louis elites, and just a few blocks away might be an African-American slave, quote-unquote, coffee house, which was a bar, but it needed to be called something else. Slaves living very close physically in a urban environment, maybe just in the back room. But in some of those houses, like the one that was owned by Mr. Dent, who was a slave owner, and his daughter, Julia, ended up marrying Ulysses S. Grant, and they get married in this small house. They share the same stairway, so that slaves that are doing the cooking and cleaning literally cross paths with the owners. In other more elaborate houses, white owners then, who have enough money, arrange their house so that those casual events where you're literally using the same space then become separate, so that there's no way that a slave can imagine a sort of physical equality of space.
I think that there's a wonderful way to tie that observation to what Teresa was talking about in terms of intimacy and inequality at the same time. Because particularly if you look at the residential patterns in St. Louis, one would expect that they're divided by class structure, and in fact they're not. The big, beautiful homes are on the avenue, but there's an alleyway, at least in back of some blocks, which means that the very closest neighbor is actually the people who have built some sort of wooden structure, hovel, whatever, perhaps out of the basement, extending out of the basement, or taking part of the space in the alleyway. It's not a neighborhood over here, a neighborhood over there. It's instead, I mean, your observation of sharing the same stairwell is a good one, on a city level, it's sharing the same lot. It's frequently sharing the same lot.
And this use of architecture as a means of perpetuating inequalities also is a key turning point in the plot of your book, The Cailiffs of Baghdad, because if the schools had been equal, physically equal, or stocked with the right kind of books, events would not have happened. So just the very fact that there were very, very few African-American schools, and although you have Julius Rosenwald, who's the president of Sears, trying to build he builds more than 5,000 schools, but less than 250 of them are scattered in the whole state of Georgia. By 1939, when your novel is set, they've already become very run down, and so the students who attend these scattered few schools first have a very difficult time getting to them, so that sort of distance through space makes it difficult for them to become educated. The buildings themselves are not well maintained, and they're not well stocked. And if you don't get a good education, then the powers that be in your town, including the members of the Ku Klux Klan, can justify their activities by pointing out the natural inabilities of these students, when actually they're quite constructed, not natural.
I mean, in some sense, I suppose, a distraction from our topic, but one of the things I found so moving about the novel as a teacher, as a professor, was the sense of the preciousness of education. I mean, what the children in the novel, what the black children in the novel and their teacher, what they're willing to do in order to get access to better education. And then the reciprocal relationship of the white children who want to help, want to assist them. But I just kept wishing some of my own students could read what it means to be deprived of an education and to have that, to have that kind of ambition for an education. It was a very moving part of the novel.
If I could follow that up by saying that this struggle for education, again, we see extending well beyond the South, that in places like the upper Midwest, during and after the Civil War, African Americans worked very hard to create their own schools because the same practices that allowed people to turn the other way, away from slavery, also allowed them to pass laws that prevented African Americans from having access to schools. And Iowa had some really magnificent, well-staffed and well-loved black schools during the era of segregation that during the challenge to the law of segregation actually eventually lost because white school boards would not hire black teachers. But that preciousness of education is borne out across the country, I think.
It's interesting to think about the degree to which illiteracy was legally forced during slavery, much like it's interesting to think about the way that after Nat Turner's rebellion, the ability to bear arms was legally opposed. It was prescribed. It was illegal. And I'm often curious about how quickly that came. Let's take away the means of learning about things by destroying any black schools that might already exist by making it illegal to teach someone to read.
Well, we're sort of wrapping up this part of our program this evening, and I just want to open it to anyone who wants to say anything further now, and I'll conclude, I think, by asking you, Leslie, to mention the film series, because you've got a stunning film series that is accompanying your symposium and these next couple of weeks.
Yes, we've been, I should say, very fortunate that we've had the help of one of our librarians at the main library, Edward Miner, who is also an Africanist, a scholar of Africa, who has helped us put together a really wide-ranging series of feature-length films and documentaries that trace slavery and its consequences. We started in West Africa last night. We'll continue to Brazil, to a French port city that was very active in the slave trade, to Mexico, to the story of Sarah Bartman, known at the time by the whites who viewed her as the Hottentot Venus. So there's a whole, again, a wide range of film that help us understand the global reach of slavery and its consequences in the world.
Well, please thank our guests. It's been a really fascinating portion of the evening. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Leslie. Thanks, you. This is WorldCanvass from International Programs. I'm Joan Kerr, and I'm inviting our next group of guests to come up here and join me on stage. We have music for the last portion of our program tonight, and I hope you can stay with us. If you'd like to hear this program again, please look for broadcast times and locations at the International Programs website, international.uiowa.edu. UITV, KRUI-FM, and Iowa Public Radio will be airing the program over the next few weeks, and an audio version of the program will be available on the Public Radio Exchange. In this segment, we will have three guests. Hi, Maurita, please join me here. And if you'd like to be in the middle, Dennis, we have Dennis Rathnaw, an ethnomusicologist teaching at the University of Iowa School of Music. And he'll tell us more about his research, but it has focused on West and Central African popular music, and he has done a lot of work in Cameroon. Murita Murphy Mead is next to me just here, and she's a clarinet professor here at the University of Iowa who has performed extensively in this country and overseas, and has a particular love for the music of Brazil. And Randye Jones has joined us as well. Thank you for coming, Randye. She's a native of Greensboro, North Carolina, an MFA student at the University of Iowa, where she's studying with Stephen Swanson. She's a soprano, and you are in for a treat. We heard her in this room before the program began, and she'll be talking to us about her research on the Negro spiritual, and will also be singing for us tonight. So welcome our guests, please. So I think tonight I'll start with Dennis and ask you to just tell us right off the bat, what is an ethnomusicologist? What do you do?
I get asked that a lot.
Yeah, I bet.
It's actually a division of musicology that's sort of more aligned with anthropology and basically any other discipline we want to incorporate into our so-called toolbox. Mm-hmm. Rather than just the sounds or texts alone, we incorporate context and performance space and aesthetic and basically the who and why and under what circumstances things are.
Right.
And that, actually, I think that's why symposia like this are important to sort of broaden the idea of slavery out into a wider diaspora or global space.
Yeah. Well, so tell us a little bit about your own career, the research you've done related to music, and let's go to the work you've done in Cameroon.
In Cameroon, I work on a popular music and its interactions with the media systems there. They've recently gone through a sort of a democratization of the media, which was under government censorship and control for a long time, and all of a sudden there's a sort of a barrage of imagery and sounds and availability of things, and when you dump this on a culture that fast, it radically transforms the performance of popular music and how things are incorporated and how consumed and processed and things like that. So I look at those things. Yeah.
Well, I have been curious about, and I hope you can give us some sense of how this happens. It seems to me that when people move, either voluntarily or involuntarily, as certainly was the case with slaves, they take their culture with them as much as they can, at least that which lives inside their own heads and their own memories and their own family traditions. So music would be one of those things that I think would be likely to move from place to place with people and transform itself over time. So in your understanding, has that been true? If you look back, a few hundred years, and slaves who were taken from Africa, the Caribbean experience, South America, and now here, the American experience with African Americans in music. Do you see that traditions from Africa have moved into all of these new locations?
Certainly, it's impossible to think about music in any of the Americas without at least a strand of African influence, and what we consider the Black diaspora or the Black Atlantic. It's a kind of a tricky situation to think about things in terms of cultural retentions or specific reliance on roots or sort of an imaginary Africa or an originary time or space that kind of relies on a static sense of culture or an essentialized notion of blackness or Africa. But it's more, I think, more productive to think about the experience of slavery or the experience of the diaspora and how that's connected throughout the Caribbean and the Americas and how that's performed. And there certainly are black music characteristics, but if you have to really look at specific cases of country to country or island or in the U.S. where these processes create what we call creolized versions of culture expression, or and to do that you need to look at the colonized input as well, whether it's Spain, France, or Britain, or the Americas, or for instance, when and where specific slave populations came from. There are religious practices in Cuba and Brazil, for instance, that are very close characteristics, Candomblé and Santeria, for instance, that are also more indicative of practices in Nigeria because their slave trade lasted so late there. Whereas in the U.S., for instance, most of our population came from the Sudanic belt further north, which has a much more Islamic, Arabic influence. So those traits kind of find their way into the blues and into gospel and things like that. So much less drum-oriented practices here.
Yeah. When we were talking a bit earlier today, you said, when we look at if we look at music and we try to say, oh, this clearly, came from, this rhythm is clearly an African rhythm or whatever, you were explaining to me that really that's probably not the best way to think about this. It's the whole sense of belonging to this greater African diaspora rather than looking for individual, chords that might follow a pattern from a particular country in Africa or some such thing. Could you expand on that just a little bit?
Well, it's kind of similar. I mean, maybe that's more productive throughout the Caribbean, where music is closely tied to these drum practices of the Bantu Congo area, or you can sort of find these timelines like clave or 12/8, long bell patterns that hang these things together, forms that are more cyclical rather than tied to European strophic forms or harmonic concepts, things like that. There are specific instances where people like to rely on, for instance, in African American early music, the development of the banjo. They like to tie this to a Senegambian instrument called the khalam, which is a string instrument. But again, it kind of depends on how far you're willing to go back in these, in tracing these things, because that instrument itself is an Arabic influenced development in that part of Africa. So, and again, another example is the clave pattern, which in American pop music we like to refer to as the Bo Diddley beat, is something that we picked up from Caribbean influences in Louisiana. So this is kind of dependent.
Yeah, right.
It becomes very, very messy, very fast, which, again, for me, is where the interest lies, in sort of the disjunctures of these things and the disruptions of history and displacement.
Well, let's talk to Murita a little bit. And you are, as I mentioned, you're involved with music in Brazil, and lots of slaves landed in Brazil. And so tell us about your work researching the choro and some of the recordings you've made.
Okay. Gosh. I'm trying to make a long story short.
Okay,
Joan.
Sure.
My trip to Africa just really sparked an interest for me in studying more of the history of the chorale and its composers. I've been performing the chorale for 14 years and never really looked into the history too much because I was so immersed in just the style, learning the style of the chorale. And chorale means to cry or weep in Portuguese, and it's a combination of African-based rhythms and the European forms and a mixture of Brazilian and European instruments. And when I was in Africa, I just heard, out in the grass, these marvelous musicians just, doing percussive things, and I just kind of went, well, that's Brazilian. And so it just really got me very curious. And so I've ventured into looking into the composers, mainly of the ones that I do play on my CDs. And, I found that when Brazil became its new independent nation in 1822, they had miscegenation, which was, combining of, different races. And then they had branqueamento, which means whitening, and that's where Europeans were immigrating to Brazil, and that's where there was more of a complication, I think, of all of the class societies. And that the race and class was becoming more complicated in the 1800s because of the whitening of the skin, and that the whitening of the skin meant a higher class of society. And so with all that, in the late 1800s, the chorale began to really kind of migrate to the city of Rio de Janeiro because of the plantation owners who really prided themselves in their fantastic plantation bands. And they would compete against each other. And the plantation owners held 2 homes, one in the plantation and one in the city. And in the city then became where they would have, fire department bands and barbershop bands, as I heard mentioned earlier today about those places. And it was in the real downtown plazas, in our center squares, where the chorale really took its root, because all these musicians, it didn't matter, they didn't have any establishment to any kind of race or class. They just came as a communal gathering and as volunteer musicians to play. And that's really where the chorale took root. Well, along comes this incredible flutist named Pixinguinha, and it means good boy in one of the African languages. And he was born in 1897. And I do have to read a couple quotes because Pixinguinha is probably the most well-known chorale composer. And his father worked in the telegraph office. And in that time, that's when government jobs were coming in, and Brazilians were able to hold more steady jobs in that way. And Pixinguinha, he formed a group of 8 players called the Oito Batutas, and it meant the 8 remarkable players. And he just happened to come upon being able to take a tour to Paris because some famous philanthropist gave them money, and a dance group in Brazil asked to see if this group could come along. And this was actually a big breakthrough for the Oito Batutas with Pixinguinha. But what also they would find was extreme discrimination as they were beginning to travel. So I'd like to quote 2 editorials. They're not very long. So I'd like to quote 2 editorials that the Oito Batutas found in their travel to Paris, and this was in 1922. I quote, "It was a true scandal when the Oito Batutas appeared. Here were Brazilian musicians performing Brazilian music in the middle of the area of Avenida that has elitist cafes and theaters, with French tailors, Spanish ice cream shops, American automobiles, and Italian booksellers. The Batutas continued to sing of the true Brazilian land, and done so sincerely, without hamming it up on their guitars and cavaquinhos. The racial war against them was ferocious. Even though the musicians were skilled as true aces, with magnificent guitarists and singers, even with Pixinguinha's flute playing that was better than any flautist with 10 diplomas from 10 institutions. Those spiteful critics began to comment on the color of the Oito Batutas, the majority of whom are black. What would foreigners think, they said, unquote. And the next author of this editorial rebutted with, and I quote, "The Oito Batutas departed this week for Paris." For Paris? But this is humiliating. How come the Ministry of Foreign Affairs isn't doing anything about it? Now Brazil will be completely humiliated. Silence, you imbeciles, you patriotic cockroaches. The Oito Batutas will not humiliate Brazil in Europe. They will carry in their guitars the songs and soul of Brazil. They will bring all that Brazil is in its feeling and natural beauty. They will bring true Brazilian music, that which is not contaminated by foreign influences and which thrills and suffers and weeps on its own accord, singing of the moonlight and the green eyes of its mixed blood. They will bring the perfume of our forests, the pride of our jungles, the grandeur of our country, the melancholy of our people, the goodwill and love of our hearts, spoken and sung in simple verse, and the simple music of the soul of the people. They will bring the true Brazil by Brazilians themselves. But they are black. What does that matter? They are Brazilians, unquote. So I'd like to actually follow with, one of the pieces on my CD by Pixinguinha. It's titled Uma Cero. It's a very, very popular choro. And it's actually a soccer score, 1-0, of when Brazil beat Uruguay for the National South American Soccer Championship. And some of the titles of the choros are just really that kind of cute and kind of funny. So, and this is myself with Rafael dos Santos, Brazilian pianist and jazz artist and professor down in Campinas, Brazil, and he is a graduate of the University of Iowa with his doctorate in piano and jazz.
Fantastic.
I tell you, your technician, he's right on it, let me tell you.
Right on top of it, I agree. So this one, even though it's a choro, crying, this is a happy-sounding song. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think they're very happy. There are chorals that are very soulful and very intimate. So I think you can find, all kinds.
Yeah.
And, based on the European forms, I certainly do not want to bring in any element of boredom into this session today. But it is, featured on the classical form of the rondo, which is there's an A part, and then there's a B part, and the A comes back to repeat, and then there's a C part, and then the A comes back to repeat again. And what's very fun about this music is that it's very typical to improvise on all of the repeated sections. Mm-hmm. And that's really been another growth area for me in my jazz development of improvisation.
Oh, so thank you. Well, so that's Maurita Murphy Mead, and you want to say something else?
I wanted to add, as far as I understand, I think it's interesting to look at how this music in the early part of the century, before the official state rhetoric of racial equality, was able to help carve a public cultural space in between the more private, elitist salon music that was happening and the lower class forms of more black, like circle dances, batuque, mishishi, things like this.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes. Thank you so much for saying that. That was a part of my findings as well, how the choral could really mix with, two different classes and, amongst the race.
Right, amongst middle class and mixed race people in public squares and, as you say, in cabarets, things like this.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you for bringing that up.
Well, now, it's a real treat to meet you today, Randye. I have to tell you that your professor, Stephen Swanson, stopped me at the last program and said, there is a wonderful, wonderful soprano studying here who does work on the Negro spiritual, and you should really contact her about being on this program. You were so lovely to say, absolutely, I'll be there. So it's our first opportunity to meet today. This is Randye Jones, and as I mentioned earlier, she's getting her MFA here, studying under Stephen Swanson, and we would like to end our program with you and with your singing, and I know you're going to sing a few spirituals for us, but perhaps you'd like to set it up a little bit and tell us about your work and your research.
Certainly. Well, I'm the second North Carolinian, I guess, in the room. I'm here via North Carolina, via Washington, D.C., via Florida. I started, I guess, just from the very beginning. I can't ever remember a time where I wasn't singing. Both in the black church. It was kind of a strange phenomenon. The church is a Missouri Synod church, but it was one of the churches that they started after the end of slavery in an effort to try to expand their church membership and to get into the South and working with blacks who newly freed slaves. And so I had a very interesting combination of German hymns and Negro spirituals. But I always had wanted to study this music. It was so much of a part of my life growing up. And when I had an opportunity, I did my undergraduate study at Bennett College, which is a black women's college in Greensboro, my hometown. It was really the first time I'd been able to combine the folk music that I had always known with a classical connection. So it was something that I became very interested in and have had the opportunity, fortunately, to sort of develop trying to study it and to learn more about it.
So what would you like to sing for us tonight, and can you share a story about these songs?
Well, actually, I wanted to try to cover a few things because there's so much about the spiritual that I think is connected to the things that have been talked about this evening, especially the importance of the music in the community of the slave during up to the Civil War. they basically had to have something, some means to be able to handle, to live with the notion of being slaves, of the continuous degradation, the never knowing from day to day whether or not their families were going to be separated, or whether or not the slave master was going to come in and rape the young women, or whatever, the different things that could simply be done to them and they had no control over. And that music, they brought that over with them. The music was just such a vital part of their ability to survive. So what I wanted to do was just talk a little bit about some of the music that came from that tradition. And I'm hoping that I can get some help from the audience. Well, you know, you've been sitting here so patiently listening to all of us talking. This time you get to do a little bit of work yourselves. The spiritual is a community music. It's a music that when they gathered in their camp meetings and so forth, someone would just create a song that had come to them during the day of their work or in the kitchens or wherever. And they might start a song, and or they may have heard a song as they were traveling to other plantations or other towns, and they would bring it to that meeting and introduce it to their members. And I think this is one of the reasons why spirituals are such a widespread music, is because it was brought in, they'd sing it, it would be reshaped as they were working, as they were listening to it or singing it. And you know, you might start singing it, don't quite like the way it's going, and you adjust it. Well, I'm going to make the life a little bit easier for us by just picking one that I think many of you are familiar with. And it's a style called call and response. What I'm going to do is sing the opening line and then introduce the response, sing the next line and introduce, and then we'll sing again the response. And then I will sing that twice to sort of, you know, oh yeah, I know, I've heard this song somewhere, or just jump in if you heard it. And then I will add a verse to that and then repeat the call and response. Sweet low, sweet chariot, that's the call, coming forth to carry me home. Response. Sweet low, sweet chariot, call, coming forth to carry me home. Sweet low, sweet chariot, coming forth to carry me home. Sweet low, sweet chariot, coming forth to carry me home. I looked over Jordan, and what did I see? Response. Coming forth to carry me home. A band of angels coming after me, coming forth to carry me home. Sweet low, sweet chariot, coming forth to carry me home. Sweet low, sweet chariot, coming forth to carry me home. Thank you.
Thank you.
Basically, spirituals could fall into three basic categories. Of course, the songs are, as I said, they expand as wide as the human imagination, I imagine. And unfortunately, because of the nature, there are only about 6,000 songs actually recorded. But you know, basically because of the oral traditions that, and the fact that people were not allowed to read and write their songs down, this really made it difficult to record these pieces. But one I just covered call and response. Another style or another way of singing would be something called a slow and rhythmic song. It was often used to share Bible stories or just to relate to one another. And of course, as you probably know, there were also times when songs were sung just to communicate that someone was about to attempt an escape and to head north and to freedom. What I want to sing is actually one of these more of a story type song. It's a song that H.T. Burley, who is the first American composer credited with composing or using spirituals as a basis for art song, and this is his setting of a spiritual called Deep River. Deep river, my home is over Jordan. Deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into campground. Deep river, my home is over Jordan. Deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into campground. Oh, do you want to go to the gospel feast? The promised land where all is peace. Oh, deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into campground. Now, in case you thought that all spirituals were slow songs, they aren't. That's one of the things that I guess I've come to understand is that this music, not only did they use it to show deep emotion, but they also use it as a means of sharing joy, of understanding that, yes, I'm a slave right now, but the time is going to come when I'm going to be free, whether that's here in this life or when I've gone on to glory. So what I want to share this time is something that's a little more up-tempo. And actually, it's basically a setting of another composer's work, Hall Johnson, who's probably better known for his choral composing, but he fortunately wrote a number of pieces for solo voice. And the way I'm going to sing this, he had suggested with a swing style. And so I'm actually going to sing it as he recommended. It's not the way he wrote it, though. If you ever look at the music, let's just say that what I'm doing is not on that piece of paper. Oh, Lord, what manner of man is this? All nations in him are blessed. All things are done by his will. He spoke to the sea and the sea stood still. Now ain't that a witness for my Lord? Ain't that a witness for my Lord? Ain't that a witness for my Lord? My soul is a witness for my Lord. Now there was a man of the Pharisees. His name was Nicodemus, and he didn't believe. The same came to Christ by night, wanted to be taught out of human sight. Nicodemus was a man desired to know how a man can be born when he is old. Christ told Nicodemus as a friend, man, you must be born again. Said, marvel not, man, if you want to be wise. Repent, believe, and be baptized. Then you'll be a witness for my Lord. You'll be a witness for my Lord. You'll be a witness for my Lord. My soul is a witness for my Lord. You read about Samson from his birth, strongest man that ever lived on earth. Way back yonder in ancient times, he killed 10,000 of the Philistines. Then old Samson went wandering about. Samson's strength was never found out till his wife sat upon his knee. She said, tell me where your strength lies, if you please. Now Samson's wife, she talked so fair. Samson said, cut off my hair. Shave my head just as clean as your hand, and my strength will come like a natural man. Oh, Samson was a witness for my Lord. Samson was a witness for my Lord. Samson was a witness for my Lord. Saul is a witness for my Lord. That's another witness. Now there's another witness. There's another witness. My soul is a witness for my Lord. My soul is a witness for my Lord.
Well, we couldn't ask for a better finish than that. Thank you so much. That was Randye Jones, and also here on stage, Dennis Rathnaw. Thank you, and Maurita Murphy Mead. And you've been listening to WorldCanvass. I'm Joan Kerr. This program is produced by International Programs. Thank you to all of you who've come tonight. Please come to our next program. It's November 12th, and it will be here in this room. So thank you all for coming. We'll see you next time. Good night.